Well, hello there, and welcome to day 77 of A Film a Day with me, Jordan Woodley. Today covering the documentary feature Crip Camp. So the documentary covers in 1971 what do the Americans call it? Resort camp? Camp for kids? Summer camp. But specifically for children with disabilities. Now, there wasn't any incentive to do this. It was just a couple of hippies who wanted to do something nice and involve and help a community of people who, at the time, although even to now, are maligned or misunderstood, which is the disabled. And this, of course, covers physically, sensory, cognitively, and developmentally disabled. So you've got a selection of different kinds of kids going to this camp. And this documentary was directed and produced and written by one of the kids who went to the camp, Jim Lebrecht, who, alongside his co-director, co-writer, co-producer, Nicola Noonan, essentially reflect on his experiences at the camp and his experiences as somebody with spina bifida. Now, and I suppose really this is always going to be the kind of documentary that has a certain personal subjectivity to me. So I don't always discuss in these videos, but I have mentioned that I am visually impaired, and to such a degree that I did go to a later in my primary schooling and throughout my secondary schooling, I went to a school for the visually impaired. The reason for that being that I wasn't born with a visual impairment because of a condition called hydrocephalus, which is a pressure buildup on the brain that caused damage to my optic nerves at about the age of 9. However, the secondary school I went to, though primarily for people with visual impairment, was and progressively became more inclusive for people with multiple disabilities, though still trying to focus on visual being the primary disability. And so watching this film, I had a very personal experience reflecting upon my schooling. I mean, this is only a summer camp, but it made me reflect on my relationship to children with similar disabilities to me, or, like I say, more complex and multiple disabilities. And I think, therefore, with that in mind, my viewing of this would be very different to your average person's, because, like anything which can sort of trigger a personal relationship, you're going to come at this from a very distinctive position. The film is a combination of the documentarian discussing his experiences with archive footage. There was some kind of documentary feature made at the time about the camp where it shows these children in the camp, doing their everyday activity as a presumably a good news feature, or some kind of documentary just exploring the idea. And then it's intertwined, both of those are intertwined with talking heads from some of the other children who now adults discussed their experiences, particularly and importantly Judy Heumann, who went on to become a prominent disability rights activist, and also then is included with news footage over the course of from 1971 when James Lebrecht went to the camp through to now, and I'll explain a bit more why that is. And this is a demonstration of what you might call acorns into great oaks, where the impression the documentary gives, and something I would believe is truth, is that the people who made the camp only made it just to allow children with severe disabilities, or not even so severe disabilities, who felt excluded or ignored by their local communities, a chance to be with people with similar experiences and to feel a bit more, for lack of a better term, normal, because they're amongst others like themselves. But what came from that, and what the documentary explores, is the idea that this camp really is one of it. I'm certain it's not the only catalyst, but it's one of the catalysts that really influenced disability rights in the US and brought together people who would later go on to fight for the rights of the disabled and head organisations. Now, on the one hand, you could say that there were a lot of children who went to the camp, and inevitably it was going to be one of, or some of them, who would go on to become the spearheads for these disability rights organisations. But on some level, the fact that they met in this environment, and the fact that as years went on and they re-encountered each other in later life but had that initial connection, means that there's something special about this camp, that you know, there's something quite you could chart it as one of the prominent origins of people making connections and realising they're not alone, and realising that there are others like them who need representation and rights. And so the documentary really is broken into two halves. The first half is very much about the camp and about the experience, and it explores the idea, you know, as I say, the talking heads are people looking back at their childhoods and saying how outsider, how difficult they found it in their homes, in their local communities, because not necessarily through ill intent, their disabilities meant that they couldn't interact with children around them in the same way. And the struggle that they'd have, especially the ones with more severe disabilities, particularly if it made them seem more unusual with speech impediments, muscular impediments, particularly children with cerebral palsy whose brains work perfectly well intellectually, their minds work, but because of the severity of their speech and movement, it gives the impression that they you know, that they are severely mentally disabled, which is, you know, and it's a hard thing to reconcile, that people, you know, in the UK we have, of course, Rosie Jones, the comedian, who has gone to great lengths to represent someone with cerebral palsy in the public eye, to demonstrate that just because you have such a severe condition doesn't mean there's anything wrong with your mind and your ability to socialise and interact. And so you have these people looking back at their childhood and looking back at how important this camp was to them. But then you go to the second half of the documentary, and I'm not going to spoil it per se, because again, this is historical fact, and it's not a narrative where there are twists. So, I'm going to sort of lightly discuss where it goes, which is, as you can imagine, it becomes about disability rights activism and discrimination in different environments. And it mentions a documentary that later came out about a hospital environment where people with learning and cognitive disabilities were incredibly poorly treated in this hospital, like disgustingly so, and how that was another trigger for those who were more able to go out there and protest and make a stink at the government about their treatment of the entire disabled community. And this is the 70s, and of course, you know, this is the time when rights are becoming a prominent issue, you know, with the Black rights movement and the women's movement, and the one which is sort of forgotten to some degree is the disability rights movement, because the 70s are the point in which the disabled community were pushing in the US for rights and recognition in a mandated, in a legislative form, you know, that would then have greater social impact. You know, something as simple as wheelchair access, which one would think, particularly nowadays, is quite a simple thing to implement, and yet was practically ignored in that time. And so it becomes about disabled rights, it becomes about protests, it becomes about a political movement and a cultural shift in the representation of disability, the recognition of discrimination against the disabled, and the move towards, you know, the constant struggle, you know, the back and forth of how to help the people who can't, you know, those who can help themselves, but because of their disability just want to get that recognition that they need help in some capacities, and those who cannot help themselves, who need defending and need someone to speak on their behalf. And it's a very powerful documentary. This is produced by Higher Ground Productions, which is Barack and Michelle Obama's production company, and both of whom have spoken, you know, about the fact that they want, now that they're outside of the political, or at least the prominent office that Barack Obama was in, that, you know, that rights campaigning, that rights conversations in the US is their next big, the thing they want to focus on, and I think this goes quite a way to helping that and showing that they you know, they're putting their money where their mouths are, and that they are, you know, this is a really important documentary. As I said, I have a very different perspective on it because, like I say, I grew up with people with a variety of different disabilities, and so for me this was more a reflection. Whereas for a lot of people, I think this will be a wake-up to realising what different disabilities look like, and the, you know, how disabled people perceive themselves, how society perceives them depending on their disability, and how the government, you know, can reject or ignore them in a way that is not acceptable now. And by no means is this an attack, you know, on any government, British, US, global. You know, what the documentary outlines is the fact that these things aren't either the government's against disabled people or it's you know, doing everything it can for them. You know, if you're going to, this is the big discussion on governments, and it's the idea that governments are not, you know, unless there's some kind of dictatorship or there is something deeply wrong, that, you know, they just do what their legislation tells, you know, requires them to do. And unfortunately, disabled rights is not something that the masses will necessarily fight for unless it is highlighted and brought forward. And so disabled people will constantly be going back and forth on different administrations, you know, gaining rights, losing rights, gaining rights, you know, and that's not a criticism that, oh, governments are crap for this reason. It's just, it's a hard pill to swallow, because it means every generation will need to defend the rights of the vulnerable and the and specifically in this case the disabled. And what I hope this documentary does is, again, highlight that, so that, you know, more people will consider that and consider what that means. And again, it's the fact that, you know, there's something to be said about the idea that of what you might call sort of the disabled gratitude. The idea that if something is done to help the disabled, that somehow that the disabled should, someone with a disability should be, should owe them something, or be grateful. For instance, things like wheelchair access, disabled toilets, that these things are somehow a gift when, for someone who is disabled, especially physically, these are a necessity. They're a human right. And so they shouldn't feel this overwhelming sense of gratitude. It should just be an expectation that something is put into place, and that is another part of this documentary, the idea of how disabled people should be perceived and how they are expected to act and how they process that. So yeah, important documentary. I think, again, this is an Oscar nominee, and I think it'll definitely be one of the major contenders. Saying that, this is my first of the best documentaries that I've seen, so I still need to see the others to see whether see how it measures up. But standing on its own, I do think it's a powerful documentary and well worth viewing. Well, tomorrow, I have put up the video for, or prepared the video for the live stream of Zack Snyder's Justice League. So you can join me at 6 p.m. GMT tomorrow as I discuss the 4-hour Zack Snyder epic. I'll be posting, of course, on Twitter at Jordan_Woodley if you want to follow me there. If you could like this video and go through my backlog and subscribe to the channel, because it helps me build the channel and work out what videos people want me to make. And yeah, if you would share the videos as well, that again helps get the videos out there. Thanks again for joining me. Take care.